Hey everyone, and welcome to the third video in this 5-part series on how to get better at Scrabble without memorizing tons of words. In this video, we're going to talk about how to manage your rack and make sure you're keeping tiles on your rack that set yourself up well for subsequent turns. It's very important that whenever you make a play, you carefully consider what tiles you're leaving behind on your rack, also known as your leave. There's a bunch of things that can go wrong if you keep certain combinations of letters. For instance, if you have bad vowel and consonant balance. Let's say I make a play with 3 tiles on my rack, so that means I'm leaving 4 tiles behind before I replenish my new 3 tiles from the bag. If I leave 4 tiles that are all vowels with no consonants, I run a very high risk of having a rack next turn that has way too many vowels, possibly even with 6 or 7 of my tiles being vowels. And that's going to make it very hard for me to make a play next turn that scores any significant number of points. Likewise, if I keep too many consonants, let's say 4 consonants and no vowels, I run a high risk of having 1 or even no vowels on my next rack, which could make it difficult to impossible for me to form any words. I also want to try to avoid duplicate letters. For instance, if I keep 3 O's or 3 I's, that's going to make finding words, especially longer words like bingos, very difficult or maybe impossible on my next turn. I also want to think about bingo propensity. So what I mean by that is how likely my leave is to draw into a bingo, given that I'll be pulling some tiles from the bag. A rack like AERST is very likely to draw into a bingo, because these letters go well with almost any other letter and tend to have a lot of 7 and 8 letter words that include them. Whereas if I keep letters like V's and W's, that makes it a lot less likely I'm in a bingo, since far fewer 7 and 8 letter words contain those letters. It's also worth thinking about synergy as opposed to anti-synergy. Letters like ing and pr that often go side by side in words have good synergy, and it's good to keep them together on a rack. But letters like u and w or f and p almost never will go side by side in a word, and they're generally awkward to deal with if you have both of them on your rack at the same time. So if you see pairs like these on your rack, it's best if you can to try to play one of them off so you don't keep both of them on your leave at the same time. I want to introduce the concept of static leave value, which is defined as how many points a leave is worth over starting with an empty rack. So what this means is if I say a leave has a static value of 5, that means I'm equally well off having that leave or having an empty rack but 5 extra points. And this is combined with the score of your play to form this term called valuation, which is the sum of the play score and the static leave value. And this is generally a pretty good measure of a play's strength. So a play might score 20 points and keep a leave that has a static leave value of 5, and that would have a valuation of 25. So what that's saying is that play would be more or less equally good as a play that scores 25 points and keeps a leave that has a static value of 0. So here are some examples of static leave values. The first couple here on the left are very good bingo leaves, so ERS and AERST. AERST, notably, is worth 31 points, so that means you're so likely to bingo with that leave that having that leave is 31 points better than having no tiles on your rack at all to start. Some more mediocre leaves are TON and DLI, all of which are in those group of tiles that I labeled as good bingo tiles, but they're not quite as strong as the E's and especially the S's, so they're more mediocre, and they're slightly better than having no tiles. They have a static leave value of about 1. The next pair here, RRUU and ENNN, are quite bad because they have too many duplicates. As we mentioned before, duplicate tiles are generally something you want to avoid whenever possible. In this case, you can see RRUU has a value of negative 18 points. So again, that means that you're better off sacrificing or more or less paying 18 full points to not have that leave, which is quite a lot. AEIO and BGLP have bad vowel consonant balance, and they both have a static value of around negative 15. Now, these power tiles on the right we'll talk about in more detail later in this video, but you can see that the blank and the S, especially the blank, is extremely strong. The blank is worth 26 points in static value, and the S is worth 8. The q in particular is very bad and is worth -7 in static value. Let's take a look at this position. So it's the first turn of the game, and you've got these tiles on your rack. There's a couple of reasonable options here, one of which would be to play the word votes for 24 points, keeping an F and a W, and another of which would be to play the word vow for 18 points, keeping an E, an F, an S, and a T. Now, even though vow is 6 points less, it's actually a much better play here. You can sort of see that from the valuation column. It's actually valued almost 13 points better than votes, and that's because its leave is much better. Vow keeps an E, an S, and a T, all of which are really good for bingoing, and then the S individually is quite valuable, as we discussed on the last slide. The leave after votes, though, which is an F and a W, really isn't great, because if you think about it, there's not that many words that have both an F and a W in them, so they're not very synergistic, which means, like we discussed before, you're much better off trying to separate them if you can, instead of keeping them together on your rack. So once again, in this case, you shouldn't take the points with votes. Instead, you're much better off sacrificing a couple points with vow to keep a much better leave. As a related example, let's talk about exchanging. There are a lot of situations I see beginner players in where they have a rack where they really should exchange, but understandably so, they don't like the idea of scoring 0 points. After all, Scrabble's about scoring points, so why would you want to score 0 when you can play something and score a couple more? The answer to that is, it's true that you're scoring 0 on this turn, but you're putting yourself in a much better position to score 30, 40, maybe even more points on the next turn or a couple turns later. If, say, you have this rack here on the screen with all 7 vowels, and you try to do something like this character is suggesting here, and play AE for 4 points, you're going to end up keeping still 5 vowels on your rack. You're probably going to end up wading through a rack with tons of vowels for the next couple of turns, and barely score any more than that for quite a while. Whereas if I take my 0 now, and I get rid of all of my tiles, or maybe just keep an E, I put myself in a much better position next turn to try to get back on track and score a lot of points. I think it's a good analogy with golf, when you slice your drive into the woods, like this golfer has done on the bottom left picture. Sometimes you really need to take your medicine and just punch out back into the fairway and try to settle for a bogey or even a double bogey, as opposed to trying to be a hero and maybe pull off a miraculous shot and get the ball straight onto the green. It's just like that in Scrabble. Instead of trying to get lucky or be a hero and draw a miraculous bingo to a leave of 5 vowels, you're better off getting rid of the vowels, starting fresh, and going from there. So let's take a look at an example of this. In this position here, it's once again the beginning of the game, and you've got a rack that's not too great. You've got 5 vowels, which is a few too many, and you've also got 2 U's together, which, as we discussed before, is not great for duplication, and also a W, which is not the best tile. So let's think about what our options might be. One of them is to play wine for 14, keeping an O and 2 U's, and another is to exchange 5 of our tiles, keeping just an E and an N. Now in this case, as we can once again see from the valuation screen, sacrificing the points is the much better option. In fact, by around 15 full valuation points, which is quite a lot. The E and the N together are quite nice as a leave, since it's well balanced, 1 vowel and 1 consonant, and they're both good tiles for bingoing. But OUU is actually quite dreadful, since not only is it 3 vowels, it also has duplicate U's, which are very difficult to work with. So in this case, you're much better off taking the immediate 0 points and exchanging, as opposed to playing wine and trying to plod through. The next thing I want to talk about is power tiles. Now, there are 10 so-called power tiles in Scrabble. There's the 4 highest scoring consonants of J, Q, X, and Z, as well as the 4 S's and the 2 blanks. And the reason they're called power tiles is because the highest scoring plays do often tend to use them. But it's important to stress that this does not mean they're always good to have on your rack. And in fact, I find that they're easily the most commonly misplayed tiles in the game, especially by beginner players, but even sometimes by intermediate or advanced players. The first tile I want to address is the Q. And the Q is a very bad tile. In fact, it's by far the worst tile in Scrabble. I cannot stress that enough. And that's even more so the case if you have it without a U. You absolutely have to stop holding onto the Q for multiple turns in a row waiting to draw a U. This is something I see very, very often in new and beginner players, and it's something that really is going to hamper your ability to score a lot of points in the long term. Now, to be clear, if you don't really have any plays with the Q, and you have a play that doesn't use the Q that scores like 40 points, and your only other choice is to exchange, then that's fine. 40 is enough points that you can afford to hold on to the Q for another turn. But you should never ever be playing for 10 or 12 points or something like that 5 turns in a row while keeping a Q without a U. And that's something I see an alarming amount of the time, and especially newer players, sometimes even surprisingly so in more intermediate players, but especially in newer players, and it's something that absolutely has to stop. Because when you're playing with a U-less Q, you're effectively playing with 6 tiles. There are so few words that have a Q without a U that you're completely eliminating your chances of bingoing or really scoring any material points with the Q unless you happen to draw a U. And the odds are just not worth it. You're always better off getting rid of the Q, even if it means exchanging it or playing QI for like 11 points, and then having a full rack to play with again and having a chance to bingo and use all of your tiles, as opposed to trying to score like 12 points multiple turns in a row, just hoping you'll maybe draw into a big Q play for 50 a couple turns down the line. It's always better to get rid of it if you have any doubt. Now, the J, the X, and the Z are a little bit different, but I still do see some similar patterns where people hold on to them, especially newer players, for way too long. And you don't have to be as aggressive about getting rid of these tiles as the Q. They are a lot easier to work with, but you still shouldn't be playing for 10 or 12 points, holding on for a tile just in hopes that you'll maybe draw a big play with it for 50 or 60 points. You're, again, a lot better off just getting rid of these tiles sooner rather than later, because it'll increase your chances of bingoing, and it'll increase your chances of drawing other big plays that don't necessarily involve those tiles. So you shouldn't be as desperate to exchange these away or get rid of them as the Q, but still avoid holding them for multiple turns in a row, especially if you have multiple of them. So if you have, say, both the J and the Z, despite what Jay-Z himself down here might think, you should definitely not keep both of them on your rack. This will significantly hinder your ability to bingo anytime in the near future. It's going to take you multiple turns to get rid of both of them, and it's really not good for your long-term rack management to have multiple of these. You should also be more eager to get rid of them if you have a good bingo leave aside from the J, X, or Z, and you're pretty confident in your ability to find a bingo. So let's say you have a J, and along with it you have tiles like E, R, N, A, S, or something like that. If you can get rid of your J for a few points, and you have a great chance at drawing and playing a bingo next turn, you should absolutely do that instead of holding the J hoping to get a big score with it. And also, if you look at the board and you don't see a lot of places where you might easily be able to play your power tile for a lot of points, get rid of it. You're much better off trying to go for a bingo or other big play. Now, on the flip side, the S's and especially the blanks are basically always good power tiles to have. Now, you might recall from a previous slide that the static leave value is 8 points for an S and 26 points for a blank. So this means, generally speaking, a good rule of thumb is that you shouldn't play an S unless playing the S will get you 8 more points than your best play without playing an S, and you shouldn't play a blank unless doing so is going to get you 26 more points than your best play without playing the blank. It is worth noting that if you have 2 or more S's, you can be a little bit more lax about playing one of your S's, since having 2 S's or even 3 S's isn't that much better than having a single S, and in some cases can clog you with too many consonants. So if you have 2 or 3 S's and you can play off one of them for just a couple extra points, even if it's not quite 8, you might want to go ahead and consider doing that. But the general lesson here is that if you want to become a better Scrabble player, you need to stop making plays like sit for 6 points or dog for 8 points using a blank. And here I've denoted using the blank with the lowercase o in dog. And it's really going to hamper your ability to score a lot of points in the long run if you're wasting these valuable tiles for such small scores and really no benefit over making a play that doesn't use them. You need to save these tiles for ideally bingoing or making a big play with other power tiles or high scoring tiles. Now let's take a look at this position here. So it's a very close game, and there's one really nice spot open here on the right hand column through this T, where there's a triple word score as well as a double letter score, so that's a spot to keep an eye on. And you note that you have two power tiles on your rack, and one of them is really bad and one of them is really good, right? You have the Q, which as we discussed you want to get rid of as soon as possible, but you also have the blank, which as we discussed is really valuable. So there's a couple reasonable options here. You could play both the Q and the blank and play the word quota through that T I just highlighted over there on the right. And that's going to get you a lot of points because you're going to put your Q on the double letter score, and then the Q is also going to get tripled along with the whole word because the A will be on the triple word score. So quota would get you 69 points, but it does get rid of your valuable blank. Another option would be to just drop the Q over here by playing the word QI for 22 points. Now, if we think about these two options, quota is getting 47 more points than QI, but it is getting rid of your blank in addition to your Q. And what was our rule of thumb from the previous slide? The rule of thumb was that a blank is worth about 26 points static value. So in this case, since quota is 47 more points, that's more than enough to justify spending the blank. Quota is definitely the way to go in this position. Now let's look at a slightly different position with the same rack. Here you'll notice that quota is no longer available and neither is QI. So our options here are a little bit different. One option is to play the word QI, making GI, which gets rid of the Q and scores 12 points, but also loses our blank. Another option would be to play the word grown from the G, which scores 8 points, but it keeps the Q as well as the blank. And finally, a third option would be to exchange 3 of our tiles, our 2 O's and our Q, to keep the blank while also getting rid of the Q. Now, in this case, you definitely don't want to play QI. As we discussed, the blank is worth 26 points, so you should never ever be spending it for 12 points when you can just as easily exchange the tiles you don't want and keep the blank. So QI is definitely out. As for grown, it does keep the blank, but keeping the Q is a real liability, as we've discussed. So for only 8 points, you're much better off just exchanging tiles, keeping ARN blank, and leaving yourself a great shot to bingo on the next turn. Now that concludes part 3. I hope you'll join me for part 4 coming up, where I'll talk a little bit more about strategy and decision making.